Good evening and welcome to Gardening to Welcome Wildlife, a Loudoun County Public Library program with the Loudoun Wildlife Conservancy. I'm Lorraine Maffa, a programming coordinator at the library, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Jennifer Smirnoff is a Virginia Master Naturalist and former elementary classroom teacher that loves helping people as they journey to welcome wildlife into their home landscape. Jennifer manages a neighborhood Facebook page for her HOA community that promotes native plants in the suburban setting. She has a wildlife certified yard and enjoys encouraging her friends and neighbors to garden with wildlife in mind. Jennifer has presented with Loudoun Wildlife Conservancy and to several Loudoun HOAs, including Belmont Green, Ashburn Farm, and Wellowsford. Welcome.
Lorraine was kind enough to share a little bit about me. We also have a certified yard, which I'm going to talk about this evening. And I'm a mom to 3 boys and love all things outdoors. So here is an example of some photos taken from my yard. Tonight I will share with you how I've made my yard a more welcoming place for wildlife. These are some of the wild animals that I have brought to my yard through the small changes that I have made. I live on a typical suburban street in Loudoun County, and typical suburban streets often mean large lawns, and large lawns often mean decreased plant diversity, water runoff issues because our grass roots are not very deep, loss of habitat through construction and development, and increased use of pesticides to keep our grass green, potential for invasives through construction and other unearthing of the native habitat that was once there. Invasives are allowed to creep in and take root, often expanding beyond just where they originally settled. And as a result, biomass is decreased. Did you know that we have over 40 million acres of lawn in the United States? And that's greater than all of these national parks combined. So I wanted to know, what did my neighborhood look like before it became a neighborhood? I did a little Google Earth search and I discovered that my neighborhood was a wild, habitat-rich, intact forest before construction. And now it is filled with suburban lawns, small houses, and some non-native plants. So what can we do about that? We can work together to welcome wildlife back into our yard by increasing biodiversity in our yards through planting native plants using nature's model of a layered landscape approach. We can encourage our neighbors to plant native, enabling properties to connect and help to act as a stepping stone, replacing habitat lost. And as a result, habitat is increased, insect biomass improves, and the animal population improves as well. So you can see here, this is the typical neighborhood when it's first getting started, and expansive lawns, not much landscape except for a tree here or there, and typical foundation planting. And as we work to add back that native habitat that was lost and slowly make changes to our yards become connected, wildlife can move more freely. It slowly begins to resemble the habitat it once was. This concept, called reconciliational ecology, is when humans work to adapt their habitat to accommodate other species. And a great resource is Bringing Nature Home by Douglas Talmey. And that shares more about this and the rationale behind why we need to welcome wildlife back into our yards. So what are some small changes that you can make in your yard to welcome wildlife? You can delay your fall cleanup. You can reduce or eliminate pesticides. You can turn off the lights at night. You can reduce your lawn. You can leave the leaves that we are planting with that Mother Nature method in mind. You can have something in bloom every season, especially spring, late summer, and fall, and you can remove invasive plants and plant native plants to welcome wildlife. So here is a photo, a few photos of my yard in the fall. You can see that I let my leaves fall where they are, and the ones that fall on the grass, I rake into my other beds. When we were planting in the spring, my son and I noticed a cocoon of a overwintering pollinator and some spring cleanup tips. Cut back your perennials when the ground is around 50 degrees consistently. So that is more than a week or so of warmer weather. And cut your stalks in an alternating height from 8 inches to 24 inches. And this allows for cavity nesting bees to find a home to raise their young. And then did you know that fireflies live 95% of their lives as larvae in habitats like leaf litter? So leaf litter is really important. And also think about it. You don't have to clean up your garden in the fall. How nice is that? Other things that you can do is reduce your lawn and eliminate pesticides. You can see here, we worked in 2020 to go ahead and reduce the expanse of our lawn within our yard. We are slowly chipping away and having less lawn in our yard, which means less to mow, less to worry about. We overseed in the spring and fall. We no longer pull our weeds by hand. That was what we used to do. Now we just overseed in the fall and have opted to have less lawn. A neighbor opted to plant plants more closely together so that he didn't even need to worry about weeds. His plants were so tightly packed that no weed could find its way in. Or you can just come to grips with the weeds and leave them there. Another small change that you can make to your yard is turn off the lights at night. Lights on at night disrupt the natural behavior of animals. It can impact animal migration and disrupt the circadian rhythm of most animals. You can turn off any unnecessary outdoor lighting. You could use motion sensors instead of keeping the lights on all night. Moths are attracted to light, and less moths mean less food for bats and other wildlife. Artificial light at night makes it harder for fireflies to communicate and thus decreases their reproduction. So turning off the lights at night will help many animals. You can use leaf mulch and leaf litter. Leaf mulch and leaf litter provide habitat for arthropod predators. It helps to keep your yard in ecological balance. It acts as a sponge when it rains. It releases moisture slowly. It decomposes and enriches the soil and helps to feed the microbes. My soil is really dark and rich and a very happy place for plants to grow. There are no splinters or dyes, unlike the dark wood mulch. It provides shelter for hibernating native pollinators. It acts as a natural weed control, and you can layer new leaf mulch on top of old and don't need to rake it out. And it's so lightweight that even my son can go ahead and do the mulching for us in the yard. Be sure to leave some bare ground for ground nesting bees. Many of our native bees are solitary and they nest in the ground. Hardwood mulch comes from trees, which can change the acidity of the soil and can possibly add wood-boring insects to plants and also your home. You can eliminate the use of leaf blowers. Leaf blowers disturb nesting birds. Removing leaves removes valuable habitat for wildlife, blowing away valuable wildlife, including insects that are food for many other animals. You can opt to rake instead, or better yet, create a soft landing for wildlife by letting the leaves fall where they may. It is recommended that if you have trees that you try to have a landing place that covers the canopy of the tree. So if your tree is 10 feet wide, then you want to have a bed around the tree 10 feet wide also, and you can plant plants in there and then just allow the leaves to fall down in the fall and stay there over winter. It's important for you to mulch correctly. Mulching correctly helps to ensure tree health, which ensures canopy and cover for many of our wildlife, and important food for wildlife as well. So in order to mulch correctly, you want to make sure that you have a visible root flare. If you take a look at the right picture, it shows the good mulching and then bad mulching of mulch volcanoing on the left. Mulch volcanoes promote the growth of secondary roots, which can encircle the trunk and choke off the tree's main roots. Some trees, such as maple, have really shallow roots, and deep mulch encourages these roots to grow up into it. Mulch volcanoes deprive the roots of oxygen, impacting the tree health, and heavy mulching also smothers wildlife in the ground layer. Other small changes you can make, include adding a water feature and a brush pile. Providing drinking water and bathing water for birds and other wildlife is important. Providing cover for many species of wildlife and many insects through a brush pile is really helpful, as it attracts decomposing material, which creates a valuable food source for wildlife. So these photos were also taken in my yard. You can work to build plant diversity. The greater the diversity of plants you have, the more robust the habitat is for a variety of pollinators and wildlife. All these plants are also interconnected through fungi in the soil. Their roots create a network where to create cover. If you take a look at one of my backyard beds, you will see buried deep inside the yarrow is an eastern box turtle. It's really important that we have cover at all layers for our wildlife, birds, small insects, and even our reptiles and amphibians. This is a fabulous slide from Audubon at Home and the Wildlife Conservancy, which talks about the animals and especially the birds that utilize the different layers of the garden structure and why it's so important to have things at all different levels. So trees that grow in the canopy are our oak, our hickory, they're going to grow up really tall. Same with our sycamore. Our mid-story trees are going to be our maples, our black gums. Understory trees, you're going to have your serviceberry and your redwoods and your dogwoods, some of your viburnums, and lower shrubs like sweetspire and blueberry and chokeberry, and then all the way down to our ground covers, our goldenrods, our sedges, and so forth. It's important that we have something at every level to recreate the habitat that they would find in the forest. It's also important to have something in bloom every season. Loudoun Wildlife Conservancy does a great job of highlighting 9 superstars that are important to have in a garden that will span the growing season. They suggest that you include these plants that are all natives to our area. They support wildlife, they are nectar and host plants for pocket pollinator gardens. If you plant these, you'll be sure to have wildlife come to your yard. This would be a great image if you have a chance to go ahead and take a screenshot. Golden Alexander is a spring bloomer. It's the host for the black swallowtail butterfly. Golden ragwort is also a spring bloomer, and it provides nectar for butterflies and native bees. Swamp milkweed blooms in the summer, and it's an important host plant for our monarch butterfly, as well as a nectar plant for other butterflies and bees. Butterfly weed is host for the monarch butterfly, and it's an important nectar plant. Mountain mint is one of my absolute favorites, and it is an important nectar plant for butterflies, wasps, native bees, and I see the most diverse collection of pollinators on my mountain mint. So it's one of my absolute favorites. Carolina wild petunia is the host for the Buckeye butterfly. It's what I have in my front garden bed. Coneflower is a great choice. Aster and goldenrod are our pollinator, our perennial superstars, bringing the most amount of pollinators into the yard in the fall and serving as a host plant for the most amount of wildlife as a perennial. It's also important, as you welcome wildlife, that you work to remove invasive plants. Some of our worst offenders are the ones listed on the screen in blue: Norway maple, Japanese barberry, bamboo, liriope, Bradford pear, English ivy, burning bush, Japanese honeysuckle, and the non-native wisteria. In the green, you will see that there are different native alternatives to plant instead of the non-native invasive. You can take a look at the slide, this left side of the slide. You can see the damage that English ivy does. Invasive plants outcompete our natives and decrease biodiversity. They also can destroy habitat, destroy homes, and make it very difficult to remove. So why are invasives bad? They lack natural predators to keep the population in control. The idea is to have plants in your yard that support wildlife and that things that animals will eat. They grow rapidly and crowd out natives. You can see here in the top right photo, autumn olive is I think across from Morven Park, if my memory serves me correct. There's a field there, and the autumn olive has expanded wildly. Down below, this is taken just in my neighborhood. Calorie pear lines a park, and it continues to spread rapidly. You can also see from the calorie pear that they leaf out early. All the native trees on the street behind it are maples, and they are not quite leafed out where the calorie pear has already flowered and has its leaves. They produce a large amount of viable seeds. They thrive in disturbed areas. They tolerate a wide variety of conditions. They damage property. They don't support our butterfly and moth species, which in turn does not support wildlife. They reduce the habitat for native species, and they decrease biodiversity. And they also contribute to the introduction of non-native animals. So are there other choices that we can make in our landscape? There absolutely are. Take, for example, a selection that I made in my front yard. I absolutely loved my neighbor's plant across the street, this firepower Nandina. If you look at the left side of the photo, the second photo from the left is their plant, and that was the non-native firepower Nandina. And I thought the fall color was so pretty, but I knew that I wanted to make thoughtful choices in my landscaping when we changed and redid our front. So I wanted to have plants that not only were aesthetically pleasing, but that also supported wildlife. And I knew, if you look to the far left, that I did not want to add invasive plants into my yard that I sought so hard to remove. This Nandina on the far left is invasive because the berries can hurt birds. They're poisonous to birds. So I found a native alternative, and the native alternative that I found is support wildlife and gave me beautiful cascading white blossoms as well. And if you take a look at my Itea virginica right now, you can see, you would see that there are all these little holes in the leaves, and that it is definitely supporting wildlife. The Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia have a great website that lets you see the tried and true native plants to replace invasive plants. So if you type in this link or take a little note of this link, this mgnv.org/plants/invasive-plants, or you can just Google in Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia and invasive plants or tried and true native plants, and it will come up with the most common invasive plants, and then it will recommend native alternatives. So if we take a look in the middle, that's a Bradford Pear, and they're recommending that to get the same white flowering plant in the spring, you can choose a dogwood, and that's the photo that's shown. And then it also gives you other alternatives like downy serviceberry. On the far right, it shows a butterfly bush, and it explains why it's problematic and then why it's desirable, why people purchase it. And then it offers some more native alternatives, including New Jersey tea that I happen to have in my yard. So this is a great option if you're looking to replace an invasive plant with a native one. So what does this talk about? Native plants, non-natives, and invasives? Well, native plants have evolved within a specific region and dispersed throughout their range naturally. Native plants provide food and shelter for native animal species. Non-native plants were introduced by humans on purpose or accidentally. Introduced species often have a benefit. So if we think about, like azaleas and other plants that we've come to like in our home landscape, they were brought here, potatoes, wheat, tulips, and they don't spread outside of cultivation. So we just call them non-natives. Invasive plants were introduced species either on accident or on purpose, and that cause health, economic, or ecological harm. For example, kudzu, if you think about driving along I-95 and down south, there's kudzu that has overtaken the areas on either side of the roadway. In Great Falls, and on the George Washington Parkway, we have English ivy that has become a real problem, and that has really expanded its outside of where it was planted, and then bamboo as well. So why should we plant natives? Well, not only do they support wildlife, they're also low maintenance, hardy. They have evolved with our temperature, our weather, our conditions. They're drought tolerant. They're used to our summers. They help to conserve water because they don't need, if they're planted in the right place, then they don't need as much water once they've gotten established. You can also take a look at the image on the right, the difference in the root structure between the non-natives and the natives. Our native plants have roots that go far deeper, and they are able to sustain periods of drought and for longer periods of time. They are in balance with nature. They're less susceptible to disease and pests. They're beneficial for stream health, and they're not invasive when they're planted at home. So we don't want to take a native plant from another place in the United States and plant it in Virginia if it's not supposed to be planted here. We want to have plants that are found within our growing area naturally. So why are native plants important? Well, a caterpillar needs 6,000 to 9,000, a chickadee needs 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars in order to raise a clutch of baby chickadees. And they're going to get those caterpillars from the native plants. The caterpillars are going to be feeding on the native plants. So everything is all interconnected. 96% of terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, according to Doug Tallamy. So what plants support the most amount of wildlife? We have oaks. Those are our big powerhouse, our keystone species, and they support over 500 moth and butterfly species. So if you have an oak in your yard, you are going to be supporting a lot of wildlife. And Doug Tallamy says if you're going to plant one plant and you have room for it, have it be an oak. Lots of other plants support wildlife, some more than others. So if you're when I was deciding what to plant in my yard, I wanted to make thoughtful choices. I knew that if I planted plants in my yard that supported more wildlife, more moth and butterfly species, then I would be supporting more wildlife in my yard. So when we added plants, we made sure we added things like blueberries and maples and birch and goldenrod and asters and Joe Pye weed and violets and black-eyed Susans and milkweed and beard tongue. And we've added a lot from this list. So I wanted to plan with wildlife in mind. So why does the number of butterfly and moth species the plant supports matter? Well, it's an important element in the food chain. Butterflies and moths are pollinators. The caterpillars provide natural pest control, eating those aphids. Areas rich in butterflies and moths are often rich in other invertebrates. Butterflies and moths are strong indicators of environmental health as they are sensitive to pollutants, chemicals, and changes in the environment. More than 90% of monarch and butterfly and moth caterpillars eat only a particular native plant or group of plants. Take, for example, our monarch caterpillar only eats milkweed. So here is a photo of a viburnum on the left-hand side, and right.
Oh, there you are. You're back.
Oh, sorry. So viburnums can support up to 97 butterfly species. This Viburnum dentatum, it's the cultivar blue muffin, is supporting wildlife right here in the photo. We have a spider in the photo on second from the right, along with some aphids, caterpillars of different moth and butterfly species. And in my yard, I have seen a sphinx moth and a Henry elfin butterfly, both of which their caterpillars use this as a host plant. So when I got started and we moved into our house in 2015, I first began by taking an inventory of what did I have in my yard, what did I need to remove, and what did I want to keep. So everything in blue is non-native. I had a pin oak, which was a great place to start, and I'm very thankful that it was there. So my pin oak supports 513 butterfly and moth species, so it definitely was staying. I had some invasive plants, barberry, liriope, miscanthus grass, butterfly bush, and English ivy. My English ivy was tearing down my front fence, so that definitely needed to go. And then I had some plants that were non-native that weren't causing any harm to my property. They weren't causing any harm to wildlife, and so I would replace them if I needed to or wanted to, but I didn't need to. And then I had a dead plant right by the side of my garage, which we did need to replace. So I began to start thinking, how can I plan my yard with wildlife in mind? So I started by mapping my yard. I created this great visual and I figured out where my sun and soil conditions, what my sun and soil conditions were. I knew I had a sunnier backyard and I had some swale issues on the left-hand side. My some pump drains out over here, so it tends to be wet and soggy. So I knew when I was planting that I needed to plant plants that could tolerate wet feet. And then I had areas that were drier, sunnier, and I had different choices that I needed to make there. So I identified my plant types. I decided what plants to remove, if any. I planned my use. I knew where it was wetter, that would be a great spot for rain garden type plants. I knew where it was sunnier and drier, that would be a good place for some pollinator plants and some flowers. I made a plan to capture the water runoff. I wanted to definitely get the water runoff absorbed so that it wasn't going down my neighbor's driveway. So I wanted to plant plants with deep roots so that we could start absorbing that. I needed to figure out where I could add natives. I had existing beds that had a crepe myrtle in it and nothing else. So I had plenty of places where I could add. I had to discover where I could add water for wildlife, and we do hope to add a pond in the backyard at some point. And then I needed to figure out where could I add shelter and cover. So here is my yard, and here's the plan I made. I knew where my rain garden was going to go. I knew that I had spots for pollinator gardens. I knew where I wanted screening. I love my neighbors, but I would like my yard to feel a little bit more private. And then I knew which plants I wanted to keep. And then the big green circles were areas where I had a tree. The front right is where my oak tree was, and the other smaller circles were all the areas where I planned to add my big trees first and smaller trees, and then start from shrubs and then go down to ground cover and fill in between. So my goal was to mimic Mother Nature and remember to have those layers in mind. So here are the changes that I made to my yard from 2015 to 2019. And then after that, I didn't keep track because I did way too much planting during 2020. We had too much free time on our hands. So I went ahead and removed the worst offenders, the barberry, the liriope, the English ivy, the grass, and the butterfly bush. And then I added all of these plants. And if you take a look in the parentheses, those are the butterfly and moth species that those plants support. So I was adding a lot of butterfly and moth species, plants for the butterfly and moth species, which in turn meant that I was adding a lot of food for other wildlife. And I continue to work to have that goal of mimicking Mother Nature in mind. My goal is to get my yard to look like the habitat that it once was. Here's a photo of my boys, and we were hiking in the George Washington National Forest. And you can see here, you have the canopy layer, you have the understory. It looks like this tree here is a red bud. You have your shrub layer, you have your ground cover, your perennials with your ferns, and then you have your ground cover layer. And I know that I want to create that in my own yard, and I know that it's going to happen. It's just going to take time. And you can see the changes that I've made, and that native landscaping can be beautiful, and I'm not done yet. So what can you do? You can start by making small changes. If you take a look here, I have some fabulous neighbors who are also working to make changes to their yard. This top left photo, a neighbor went ahead and extended their bed, and they added host plants and nectar plants for monarch butterflies. My other
Hang on, everyone. Jennifer's having, oh, there she is. As soon
oh
as I
goodness.
start explaining, you come back on.
Sorry. So this bottom left photo, my neighbor went ahead and removed the lawn in between the fence so he didn't have to weed whack, and he added native plants in there. The middle photo is a downward swale, and I didn't want to weed whack along the fence, so I added native plants there to make it convenient for me, as well as to work to start adding some of that habitat that was lost. And then a neighbor had a small narrow path going from their driveway to their backyard, and they added some ground cover in the form of native plants. And you can see in parentheses the wildlife, the butterfly and moth species that each of these plants support. So these small changes really do have big impacts. When we were down in DC over the summer, we had a chance to see neighbors that were utilizing a very underutilized space and creating habitat. So these folks created habitat in a health strip, in between your sidewalk and your street. You can see swamp milkweed, black-eyed Susans, butterfly weed. There's water and grasses, a great place for wildlife, and a great place for birds to visit, to find food. So you can see here, we started by adding to our existing spaces. My yard was a blank canvas when I started, and so we had to start somewhere. So we picked beds that were already created, and in this bed was one crepe myrtle. So it had the canopy layer or the understory layer, and I just needed to continue to provide layers below. And the photo from the close to the beginning of the presentation where you saw the turtle that was hiding, that has since completely filled in. And I no longer really need to mulch in that bed much anymore because I have a layer of green mulch through my plantings. So in the top photos, that's goat's beard. It's a great shrub. I absolutely love it for shade. It's beautiful. I have the native hydrangea, and I have coreopsis, and then purple coneflower. Another place that I tucked in some native plants in an existing bed was I added some beard tongue, your penstemon, your another hydrangea. I like my hydrangeas, bee palm, and then mountain mint. So we also went ahead and replaced our front landscape beds. Now remember, I did this over time. It is now 2022, and we started this journey, I want to say, when probably in 2017, right before I became a master naturalist. So we started our journey to make some changes. So this has definitely been over time. And one of our big changes was we replaced all of our front landscaping. It was overgrown, it was non-native, and it was constantly needing to be trimmed. So we needed to make it look pleasing and support wildlife. So we tried to have a balance. Doug Talame says if your yard is 70% native plants, then you are doing your part to support wildlife. You can see my before photo, and then in the middle and on the right is my after photo. And I have Blue Star, Ansonia tabermontana. In there, I have a New Jersey tea, which supports wildlife. I have my Itea virginica, my Sweet Spire, Little Henry, that supports wildlife. But then I also have some of my favorites, and I'm really big into that whole formal cottage garden look, and I really like hydrangeas and boxwoods and alliums. So there is space in your yard for those things. You can have the plants you love and support wildlife at the same time. So the other thing we asked ourselves was, do we need all that lawn? And we did not. So in 2020, we worked to, we didn't have anything else to do. So during the beginning of the pandemic, so we worked to help landscape more of our yard with native plants. We took this whole left front side yard, and that is now all landscaped and shrub. I have solved my water runoff issue. I now have tons of pollinator plants like ironweed and milkweed and joe pye and clethra that are in that corner to help soak up all that moisture that's coming down from my sump pump. My front right side yard, we used more of that lawn, so I kept more of it. And we planted a serviceberry and inkberries, and I have oak leaf hydrangeas there. And we've just worked to make changes over time and support wildlife. You can see on the bottom right-hand side, there's a swallowtail caterpillar. So you may be saying, oh, this is great, Jen, but I have a small yard and you have a 1/4 acre. Well, my neighbor, Michelle, has done a fabulous job with taking her townhouse backyard and turning it into the most magnificent monarch way station. So it doesn't matter the size of your yard, you can still add wildlife and add native plants to add wildlife. Michelle went ahead and she took out a playset back here. We drew up a plan together. We talked about grouping plants into groups of 3 to 5. This was a small space at first. She's since made it bigger and added more plants, but we grew the front side that you see, and she also extended the bed on the back side as well. And she raises hundreds of monarch caterpillars every year, and she is an expert. So she's phenomenal. But you may be saying, this is great, but I have a shady yard. Well, don't worry, there are native plants for every site, sun, and soil condition. So the most important thing is to pay attention to the soil, sun requirements and the size space you have. These photos are taken at Wolf Trap. It's a great spot for shady garden ideas. So you can see that there's cardinal flower in the far left photo, the red flowering plant. You have turtle head, the bottom right of the left photo. On the far right photo, you have a button bush, which is a really interesting plant that has globular flowers, and it's a great replacement to a butterfly bush. You can get, there's a dwarf size that's called Sugar Shack if you need something that's smaller. The straight species will grow up to be a little bit taller and be more tree-like. Sedum stonecrop is the ground cover below the button bush, and then you have ferns and the native hydrangea. Another neighbor in my neighborhood, we created a backyard plan that took into account her existing trees that were circled, the big circles you see here. And then, so she had her canopy layer, she had maple and birch and a few other trees that my mind is forgetting which ones she had. And we worked to layer down below. So we added shrubs and grouped our plants together again, and put like plants together, and we tried to create multiple seasons of interest. So it's important that when you're thinking about gardening that for wildlife, that you make sure that you have early spring and late summer, fall plants. And those can include early spring. You have viburnums that flower early. You have your red buds, shown in the beautiful purple, shown here, maples, choke cherries, your baptista, your false indigo, coreopsis, your beard tongue, your penstemon, blueberries, violets, serviceberry, spicebush, dogwood. Those will all flower early. And then, so that's important for our newly emerging bees. That's important for, other wildlife. And then the late summer and fall is really important for those butterflies that are trying to make long journeys, that are trying to solidify their offspring and help get the next generation started. So we need to make sure that we have asters and black-eyed Susans and so on and so forth, so that we're supporting plants. We have supporting plants when pollinators need them most. When you're thinking about pollinators and you think about your garden design, it's important to have your tallest plants in the back, your shortest in the front, and include plants for every season, as I just mentioned. It's also important for you to have a puddling area. So that could be something as simple as like just a shallow tray or dish or pan, and then some rocks in there. Give them places to rest. It needs to be in a sunnier location with low wind. You need to have a balance of host and nectar plants. You need to create shelter. So you want to have your plants tightly packed together so that if you have monarch caterpillars feeding on one milkweed, they don't have to walk really far to once they've eaten all the leaves off one to go find another plant to munch on. And that helps to create shelter so that they can avoid predators. You want to plant in multiples of 3 or 5, and it's really important to avoid plants with pesticides that have been pre-treated. You want to skip any double flower heads as they produce less nectar, and it's harder for pollinators to reach the pollen. And then you want to avoid hybridized plants that are bred not to seed, or that as they produce little pollen and don't offer seeds for birds in the winter. And then it's important to avoid plants that have been changed drastically from the original straight species, like changes in leaf color. So you might be thinking, oh, this is great. And I have a butterfly bush, so I'm doing my part to help wildlife, right? Well, butterfly bushes only are a nectar plant, and so they don't support the whole food web. We want to make sure that when we are planting, that we have nectar and host plants. So butterflies do like it. They're attracted to the color and the blooms that are massed together. And there are other alternatives that we can plant, like mountain mint and buttonbush and sweet pepper bush, the clethra. So a host plant it supports the butterfly's life cycle. It's the location where the butterfly lays its eggs. It's the food for the caterpillar, and it's very butterfly specific. The nectar plant is what attracts the adult butterfly and feeds and nourishes the adult butterfly. And together, when your garden has both, then you're helping to support the butterfly life cycle, and in turn, you're supporting our wildlife food web. One of my favorite resources that Loudoun Wildlife just got back into stock is the field guide for Loudoun County butterflies. And this is a fabulous resource because it shows you the common butterflies and moths that you might have visiting your yard. It talks about the host plants that that the butterflies rely on to continue their life cycle, as well as the nectar plants that attract them. And I think Watermark Woods out in Hamilton has it back in stock. And then also you can go online to loudonwildlife.org and purchase it from them. So it's a fabulous resource. It's another one that's great if you're out and about hiking and you want to know, hey, what's that butterfly that I see on my walk? It's a great small field guide to have. Audubon at Home can help you get started as you work to certify your yard and welcome wildlife into your habitat. So they have trained Audubon at Home ambassadors that can make house visits, take a walk through your yard. They can talk to you about what invasive plants you have, what are great plants that support wildlife. They just ask that you make a healthy yard pledge, saying that you're going to work to conserve and protect water, that you're going to work to plant natives, that you're going to remove invasives, and that you're going to reduce and eliminate pesticides. So they want to know that you're committed to making a change within your yard to welcome wildlife. They also want to ensure that your yard has the things that wildlife needs to be successful and to have a proper habitat. So that's food in the form of native plants, not just bird feeders, and that you offer your wildlife shelter, so you have plenty of cover, both on the ground level, shrub level, and canopy and tree level, that you provide water, and that you have protection from them. So this is a great place to get started, and they are amazingly helpful. Now, they are not landscape designers, so they are there to help support you in your journey and give you some resources, but they can even help say, oh, this is, looking at your yard, this is a good spot for maybe putting a pollinator garden, but they're not going to sketch out every little place where a plant is going to get planted. So that's going to be on you to do, but they can definitely help you in your journey. Some things that have helped me in my journey are the Plant Nova Natives resource. This resource is fabulous because it talks specifically to plants that are native to Northern Virginia. It shares with you the rough adult size of the plant when it's done growing. But know that if a plant is happy, it may continue growing beyond the size that it says in there. My plants are very happy and far larger than I thought they would be. But it also shares the sun and soil conditions. So it'll show you the different pictures of the sun. It'll say an M with a water droplet around it. If it's moist soil, a W if it tolerates wet feet. It also says whether it's a host plant, as with the little caterpillar symbol. With the butterfly symbol, it shows whether it's a nectar plant, and with the bird symbol, it shows whether it provides seeds for birds. So you know, if you're planting turtlehead, then you're supporting a lot of wildlife, and I actually have some really pretty turtlehead in my yard. Plant Nova Natives also uses these red stickers that you see in the oval shaped, and they place those on items in different local nurseries like Meadows Farms, Merrifield, Abernathy, and Spencer, so that when you're going shopping for plants in our local nurseries, you can identify what plant is native to Northern Virginia. So they have that red oval that says Nova Native, and then you know that you're selecting a plant that is helping to support wildlife. And if you're looking to support wildlife, a great recommendation is Watermark Woods out in Hamilton is one of our native only nurseries, and so every plant there will help to support wildlife. Another great resource that I've really enjoyed is Pollinators of Native Plants, and this book by Heather Holmes is fabulous because it talks about the plant and insect interactions. So if you want to learn more about the plant and pollinator interactions and really want to spend time learning about the critters that you're inviting to your yard, I recommend that. And then just to have an understanding of why it's so important to welcome wildlife, I highly recommend Douglas Talmay's book, Bringing Nature Home. So, and if you plant it, they will come. And we've made a lot of small changes over the years, and I have had so many wonderful critters come to my yard as a result. And then Thank you again to Loudoun Wildlife Conservancy for helping to support this talk and get the message out. Thank you.